The rain had started just after dawn, a thin mist at first that clung to the pines and turned the forest into a breathing, whispering thing, and by the time Daniel Mercer realized he had gone too far off the marked trail, the sky had already collapsed into a dull gray ceiling that swallowed sound and distance alike, making every direction feel the same. He had only meant to take a short detour, just a half mile or so, chasing the faint impression of something unusual he thought he'd glimpsed between the trees. A flash of color, maybe some fabric, maybe an animal, but now the trail behind him had vanished, as if erased, and the forest around him felt older than it should have, heavier than it should have, like it was watching him instead of simply being. And though Daniel prided himself on being experienced, he'd hiked dozens of national parks, navigated rough terrain, even taken survival courses. There was something about this place that made his confidence feel misplaced, like bringing a compass into a room where directions didn't matter. He checked his watch, noticed with a small jolt that it had stopped sometime in the last hour, the second hand frozen mid tick, which made no sense because he had just replaced the batteries the week before. He laughed nervously, muttering to himself that it was probably just the moisture. But the sound of his own voice seemed to disappear too quickly, swallowed by the damp air around him, and that's when he realized he hadn't heard anything else for a while. No birds, no insects, not even the wind. Just suffocating, unnatural silence. Silence that pressed against his ears until he almost preferred the sound of the rain, which had begun again, soft and steady, tapping against leaves and branches in a pattern that felt almost deliberate, like a code he couldn't understand. He turned slowly, trying to orient himself, but every tree looked identical. Every rock seemed placed with intention to confuse. And the slope of the land shifted in subtle ways that made it impossible to tell whether he was going uphill or down. He pulled out his phone, only to find there was no signal, which he should have expected, but also no GPS loading at all. Just a blank grid that flickered and then went dark as the battery suddenly dropped from 60% to 10 in mere seconds, which made him swear under his breath, and he shoved it back into his pocket, telling himself to stay calm, to think logically, to retrace his steps. Except he couldn't remember exactly which direction he'd come from, which was absurd because he'd only been walking for maybe 20 minutes, 30 at most. And yet the memory felt foggy, incomplete even, like trying to recall a dream that was already fading. And then he saw it again. That flash of color, deeper in the woods this time, unmistakable, a bright red that stood out violently against the muted greens and browns. Despite every instinct in his body telling him to head the opposite direction, Daniel felt compelled to follow, as if the forest itself had shifted his priorities. He moved cautiously at first, calling out just in case it was another hiker, but his voice still seemed to vanish too quickly, giving him that unsettling impression that he wasn't being heard, or worse, something was preventing the sound from traveling. As he got closer, the red resolved into a piece of fabric caught in a branch. A child's jacket, small and worn, the sleeve torn slightly as if it had been snagged and left behind in a hurry. Daniel's stomach tightened because he knew there hadn't been any reports of missing children in the area, at least none that he had heard of. And yet the jacket looked old. Not freshly lost, but not completely weathered either, existing in a strange in-between state that made it impossible to judge how long it had really been there. When he reached out to touch it, the rain stopped near instantly. Not gradually or slowing down, but just a sudden, all-at-once end, like someone had flipped a switch. And the silence that followed was even deeper than before. So complete, in fact, that he could hear his own heartbeat echoing faintly in his ears. And that's when he noticed the footprints. Small, barefoot impressions in the damp soil, leading away from the tree, heading deeper into the woods. And before he could stop himself, he began to follow them, each step feeling less like a choice and more like an inevitability, as though he had already decided long ago and was only now catching up to that decision. The forest seemed to change as he walked. Trees grew taller, their trunks darker, the spaces between them stretching into long corridors that bent slightly at the edges, creating this illusion that the path ahead was always just out of clear sight. He began to feel disoriented in a way that went beyond simple confusion, a kind of slipping sensation in his thoughts, like part of his awareness were lagging behind or skipping ahead. He tried to focus on the footprints, counting them to keep himself grounded. 1, 2, 3, 4. But every time he reached 10, he realized he couldn't remember the first few. As if the count reset without his consent and the footprints themselves began to change. They became less distinct,